Okay, so welcome. The slides are also online. They're behind this QR code. I can also ask the organization to distribute the link later if you want them. So you don't have to take pictures or something because you'll get them. So far you've been working on step 2. So hopefully you've been working on matrices and matrices and matrices and matrices and matrices. And that basically summarizes step 2 because those matrices of change objectives are kind of like an overview, a summary of all the work you've done in step 2 to summarize what should change. Then eventually you want to move towards an intervention. And that's what you'll be working on mostly in step 4. So in between, now, step 3, we'll discuss what's actually under the hood in the intervention. Basically, the mechanisms of action, the things you put in the intervention that target the things that need to change, that you put in the matrices in step 2. The idea is that you have an intervention. These are examples from nightlife settings, which is my original substantive research area, back when I still had a substantive research area. And these interventions, we design them because we want to make people happy and or healthy. And usually we focus on health rather than happiness, which might seem weird, but it's because actually when you make people healthier, you save a lot of money. And generally funders fund things that they think will save governments money. So generally we focus on improving people's health because the assumption is that that will also make them happier. To do this, we can't actually directly target their health or their quality of life. We have to work, frustratingly enough, through people who are individuals, and that makes it all a lot more complicated. So these people perform certain behaviors, and we usually define behavior as stuff controlled by your muscles. Talking is also a behavior that's also ultimately controlled by muscles. So that's generally how we define behavior. Not always. Sometimes you define deciding something as a behavior as well. But generally, behaviors are things people do with their muscles. And muscles are controlled with the central nervous system. And we know that the central nervous system is controlled from our brain. So basically, that means that ultimately, the question is, how do we change stuff in people's brain? So to do this, you take a scalpel and you cut closely. The question is, what do we have to change such that at the right moment, the right signals are sent to the motor cortex, so that at the right moment, people perform the right behavior. For example, they decline a vape that's offered, or they decide to put their desk in standing mode, to give some completely random examples. In your brain, there are brain cells, neurons, and they're generally depicted somewhat like this. There are a lot of them, about 90 billion. Billion. I always get confused between Dutch and English because it's a different word. Like, not trivially a different word, but we also have billion, but it actually has a different quantity. So we have about 90 billion brain cells, which is a lot. So just for reference, we have about 200 billion stars in our galaxy and about 8 billion people on the planet, which is really a lot. Like, I've met maybe 1/3 of that, if that. So that's really a lot of brain cells. And they're connected to, on average, 7,000 other neurons. Back when I learned psychology, which I did here, like more than 20 years ago, you had these textbooks about biological psychology, and they drew these neurons. And then it seems like on the picture on the background, they're connected to like 2, 3, 4 other neurons. So I felt kind of cheated when I discovered that actually they're connected on average to 7,000 other neurons. So that's what we have to start changing. But before that, to make sure everybody's on the same page, because generally by this point, the speed between groups can vary a bit, I start with this redux that Rob already introduced so nicely. So ultimately, we want to improve people's quality of life. And we do this generally to influencing their health, but also if you don't care about people's health or you're just not interested in targeting health at the moment, then still you work through people's behavior. Because their quality of life, their experiences are determined partly by their environment and partly by their behavior. This behavior and their health are determined by their environment and by their personal determinants. Personal determinants are defined as everything that's inside the person. And then the environmental conditions are the stuff around it. So you have the person with their determinants, their psyche, basically. And then you have the interpersonal environment. We are now each other's interpersonal environment. Then you have an organizational environment. For example, Rob, Rick, and Francine and Jeroen are in the same organizational environment because they work at the same university, and the university has a university board, which could decide at some point everybody can only buy fruit in the canteen, which would of course have health consequences directly. That's something you can't do in an interpersonal environment because there's not a manager, generally. And you also can't do it in a personal environment. Then you have communities with leaders, for example, in a church or something. You have a society, like a country, where you have politicians who can also create legislation. And you have the supranational environment, basically the world, where you have actors like the WHO. And at all these levels, there are different things you can do to try changing things. When we talk about behavior, generally, we use a kind of umbrella term, a kind of vague term, like we want to make sure that people don't vape, or that they don't sit too much, or that they eat healthily, or that they don't use social media dysfunctionally. But this doesn't help us much in thinking about why people do these things, or about how to help them. For that, we need to distinguish sub-behaviors. And we call those sub-behaviors performance objectives in intervention mapping, because they become objectives that we want to change, and they're about the performance of people. These environmental conditions are generally under the control of environmental actors. So if you do something in a hospital, the hospital has a director, or a direction. If you do something at a school, there are teachers, but there are also managers and directors there. You have politicians. So environmental conditions are under the control of people in the environment, environmental actors, and they exert their control through their behavior. They decide to budget for certain things or not. They decide to change legislation or not. And these behaviors, of course, since they're humans, just like target population humans, again have performance objectives. And these performance objectives, again, are determined by environmental conditions and by personal determinants. And those environmental conditions are, of course, under the control of environmental agents. And those environmental agents, etc., etc., etc. So the bottom line is, we need to know how to change personal determinants, and then we can control the world, or at least make people happier. So we get back to people's brains, and how to send the right signals to people's motor cortex. Unfortunately, we do know where people's motor cortex is, like roughly here, like not yours, mine, but yours is the same place in your head. But it's not the case that these determinants, people's knowledge, people's skills, attitudes, perceived norms, are also somewhere in their brain. That's why, even though if you spend like an hour cutting with a scalpel, you still don't find people's attitude and where to change it. I've tried it on like dozens of people and it just doesn't work. So this is not a viable approach if you want to change behavior, even though we know this is ultimately what we have to do. We have to change stuff inside people's brains because their brains control their motor cortex, and if we want to change health or quality of life, we have to make sure that the motor cortex sends the right signals to their muscles at the right moment. So let's look at those neurons again. Not everybody here probably had biological psychology, so I share one of those pictures from those beautiful textbooks. They look roughly like this. And the idea is that these are connected to each other, not like this, but with 7,000 connections. And they can fire, as it's called, at least in Dutch. I'm not entirely sure about the English term anymore. But okay, they can fire. And through firing, they can excite or inhibit other neurons, which are then more likely or less likely to fire. So you get this kind of spreading activation. And this is a useful starting point if you want to think about how to change what you need to change if you want to change behavior. And to illustrate it, there's a brief interactive exercise, because people told me it's a good thing to have interactive exercises because then people can breathe. It's fun. The idea is, I will now, or actually PowerPoint will now show a sequence of words. And all you have to do is to remember them. You can't write them down, you just have to remember them. And then after the sequence of words is shown, I'll show a second sequence of words. And some of the words from the first sequence will be in the second sequence. And the only thing you have to do is recognize which ones from the first sequence also occur in the second sequence. Ready? Anybody need an energy drink or something? No? Okay, let's go. Okay, time for the second list. Cloud. No? Very good. Hospital? Office? Table? Dentist? Lawyer? Sick? Carpenter? Doctor? Haha! Doctor was not in the list. This alone is one of the reasons why Rob likes watching this lecture, of course, because this worked every time. So this is called the Dies-Rudiker-McDermott paradigm, or the DREAM paradigm, which is funny because that's kind of how the acronym sounds, and because the original example uses sleep-related words. And the idea is this. Basically, the idea is that in your mind you have representations of these concepts, of these words, and every time you read one of these words, they activate related words through this spreading activation, similar to how these neurons activate and inhibit each other. Because you read all these doctor-related words, the word doctor, the concept of doctor in your mind, receives enough activation such that when I ask you, was doctor in the list, you think, oh, it's so activated, must have been in the list. Because, of course, when I ask you what happened in the past, you can't rewind time or play back some movie in your mind. We use different ways to determine what happened. That's what people mean when they say that memory is mostly reconstructive. Here, you kind of probe, I don't know how, I imagine they have like somebody in your mind who goes check out the activation, makes a picture, and then like, oh yeah, that's high enough. You probe the activation of the relevant, the target concept, and then you think, oh, that's so high, must have been there. This spreading activation is useful if you want to think about how to change things in people's minds. You can think about, oh, yes, a question.
Yeah, a question. Does that exercise also work if you know, like, what you're trying to do?
So the question is, I'll repeat it because I'm trying to record it and I'm not sure whether you reach the microphone here. So the question is whether this exercise, this task also works if the target audience knows what's happening. Well, then they will be on the lookout for what they estimate will be the last word, and then they'll be extra critical. I don't think you can actually override the way you determine whether something occurred. But as far as I know, and this is experimental psychology, which is not something I do normally. Back when I learned about this in my bachelor, like 25 years ago here, there were a few lists of words that they used a lot. So I guess if people are familiar with it, they will know the lists, and they will then also know the target word. If you would have a new list and you tell people about it, then I think the most distortion would be that they would try to gauge what the target word would be. But I mean, the process, the way your metacognitive functions, the way you try to assess whether something occurred, that of course doesn't change. They can't then suddenly rewind time if they know what it's about. Maybe they can, I don't know whether that's been studied, but I very much doubt it. Okay, so imagine that you have a given behavior, or actually any representation of anything, because we as organisms in this world have a memory, so we store stuff and we have representations about things. And those things are also behaviors and what happens if we engage in a certain behavior. And you can consider those, you can break them down into tiny little bits of representation. So any given behavior can be more or less interesting, can be more or less easy. You can consider yourself more or less skilled at performing the behavior. You can perceive many obstacles surrounding engaging in the behavior of you, etc., etc. There are loads of attributes. And of course, those attributes, I now use words, because language is convenient for communication. That doesn't mean that those are really in our mind like that, of course. But they're still useful to think about how people represent the world. And of course, some of those are more closely related than others. When people experience a lot of shame around a behavior, they'll probably also feel more guilty when they engage in the behavior. When people consider a behavior more exciting, they might also consider it a little bit more scary. So these are not unrelated things. That means also that if you inform people about something, a behavior or something else, a movie, and you tell them that it's very scary and it makes you kind of a bit afraid or whatever, some people might then think, oh, that's a very exciting movie, even though you didn't tell them that, because they actually consider scary things exciting. So you have these representations in your mind, and they're not completely independent, they're related to each other. What psychology does, kind of, is clump together some of those that act similarly in how people work, so they're functionally similar, or that are just similar, like semantically similar. For example, you could say people's intention to engage in a certain behavior is kind of determined by how they represent the behavior in terms of all these dimensions. So then you define something, a construct, and then you say, therefore, if you follow this definition, if people consider something more interesting, they're more likely to have an intention to do it than if they don't consider it interesting. If people think their partner approves, in the bottom right corner, they're more likely to engage in something than if they think their partner disapproves. So you can define things like that, and then you can use it to study why people do what they do. Similarly, you can define more specific parts of people's psyche. So you can say everything that has to do with whether people think they can do it, so their perceived skills, their self-efficacy, their perceived obstacle ubiquity, so whether they think there are many obstacles to performing the behavior, all that together, we can call it the perceived behavioral control or self-efficacy people have over the behavior. And everything regarding their perceived norms, what other people think they should do, or what they think other people do themselves, we call that perceived norms. And people's estimation of the consequences of the behavior, the expectations about the consequences, and their evaluation of those consequences, we call that attitude. And of course, you can slice people's psyche up, not literally this time, but conceptually. You can slice people's psyche up in different ways. So some theories might say pleasantness and interestingness together with maybe some other attributes, we call that experiential attitude. Another theory might say pleasantness and satisfaction, we clump those two together and we call it intrinsic regulation. When you're interested in behavior change, you don't really care. You only care about getting all the little balls, so to speak. You want to map the complete psyche of participants to the degree that it pertains to the target behavior. Because then you know whether they do the behavior because of habit, or norms, or impulse control, or knowledge, or self-efficacy, whatever. You need to know those. Which theories those come from doesn't really matter, as long as you map as much as possible. And then usually theories are depicted not like in the previous picture, but like this. So you have boxes and arrows, basically. But each of those boxes is defined, and thereby delineates a bit of people's psyche. Which representation you use doesn't matter too much, but it's useful to keep the one at the top right in mind. So it's not about whichever theory the way it looks in the bottom left. It's about covering everything the way you see it in the top right. So, back to people's brains. These constructs, psychological constructs, we call them determinants when you do behavior change, because they determine behavior. Not everybody's very creative when they think of these terms, but that has deductive benefits. So those are generic psychological constructs that are assumed to partly cause behavior. So the idea is that these are generic, so they exist for pretty much any behavior or any target population. They might all be relevant for they might not all be relevant for every target population. Some things are just habituals and some aren't. But you can still conceive of a habit. Something can, even a behavior that is not habitual for 99% of the population, can still be a habit for 1%. And even a behavior that's completely privately determined and is not influenced by perceived norms for most people, can still be influenced by perceived norms for some people. But in principle, this way of thinking works for everything. And then you have different levels, and at the bottom level, they become very specific. And they don't pertain to everything anymore, because they are contextualized within a single population and a single behavior. So the expectation that if you sit behind your desk all day, as opposed to standing up frequently, that's an expectation that will be very relevant for sedentary behavior in the workplace, but it will not matter for whether people use social media too much, or whether they decide to start vaping. However, if you develop an intervention, of course, you always communicate at the specific level. You can't communicate at attitude level. You can't say, have a higher attitude. No, you have to find out which specific expectations are relevant, and then target either the expectations themselves or people's evaluation of the expectations. So you have this kind of continuum from generic to specific, and the generic bits are needed for linking to behavior change. I'll get to that. And the specific bits are relevant for targeting in an intervention. So the specific bits are the little balls, little circles, and the generic things are the determinants as they are, as you find them in psychological theories. So for example, you can have somebody's intention to drink coffee at lunch, and then you can make it more and more specific. You can say attitude is already a bit more specific. Experiential attitude, so attitude as it relates to experiences, or expected experiences, is even more specific. The belief that you will feel energetic is even more specific. Experiential attitude at least exists for other constructs. Well, the belief that doing something may make you feel energetic can also exist for other constructs, like using social media, but it will probably be much less relevant. And then, of course, as we all know, drinking coffee in Maastricht has very different effects from elsewhere in the world, so you can make it even more specific, and then you can go on and on and on. And the more specific you make it, the less relevant it will be to a large group, but to those people for whom it is relevant, of course, it will be more relevant. And when you develop interventions here, there's always a kind of balance. You're not always able to tailor a lot, to make your intervention such that it can differ a lot for different persons. Sometimes you just have to make something for billboards, which cannot be tailored at all. It's just the same for everybody. And then you have to find some location here where you find something that works for 60% of the population and just accept that it will just be irrelevant for 40%. But sometimes you can actually tailor. You can make a script, you can have people who talk to people, and they of course can adjust what they do based on what they see, and then you can target more specifically. Okay, so those little things in the balls, we generally call them subdeterminants, and you formulate them as change objectives in step 2. Because once you select a subdeterminant, because you decide it's important enough to target, then it's a change objective, it becomes an objective to change. And there are spreadsheets like this one, for example, to help with that. There you list all the subdeterminants and then you choose which ones to target. Okay, so those personal determinants can be split up into subdeterminants, just like the behavior can be split up into performance objectives. As I think Rick, oh yes, question?
When you're doing the research, literature research, to get a grasp of the determinants, you already make a distinction between specific target groups that are in certain papers that provide information on subdeterminants. Do you understand what I mean? So you make a distinction in your literature research between these are things for a wider target group, and these are things that are important for small groups.
Yeah, so the question is whether if you do the literature review, you also pay attention to the degree to which the target population is similar to yours, or whether it's wider or just different. And that's definitely true. Like you prefer to have evidence about your target population. Of course, you will not find that generally, because that's life. And then sometimes you have evidence from a target population that's similar, but from a different country, or a bit older, or sometimes it's just a slightly different behavior or a much different behavior. And sometimes about a very generic behavior versus specific behavior.
And then you work with what you have?
It depends on your resources, as always. If your literature review gives you basically what you need, then you don't need to do empirical research. But that would require data from basically your population and your behavior from the recent past, which usually is not the case. So ideally, generally, you have resources to at least do qualitative and quantitative research to find out what is relevant to the people you want to help. Unfortunately. Okay, so I think Rick normally does the presentation on step 2. So he went into the confidence interval-based estimation of relevance plots, which you use to select the determinants. So for example here, we would determine that the belief that if you use a high dose of ecstasy is a drug, and we did research about using highly dosed pills versus regularly dosed pills. If you use especially high dose, that making contact with others is easier. And on the right, you see that that's positively correlated with intention to actually use a high dose. And if we want to prevent people from using a high dose, that would mean we would have to move the people on the right side of the left plot to the left side of the left plot, because then their intention will decrease. On the other hand, at the bottom, you see that the belief that a high dose is less good for your health also correlates positively. But everybody already believes that actually it's negative for your health, so we can't move people. So we wouldn't select it for an intervention. So to put everything together in what we call the causal structural chain, eventually you want to target the target behavior, and we split it up into sub-behaviors. Every sub-behavior is predicted by determinants which consist of subdeterminants that are relevant to your specific target behavior. And then there are the 3 missing links which we'll discuss today. Normally this is where I'd ask whether there are any questions, but I think people took the liberty, which is good, to ask questions as we go. So if you now realize, oh, but I have a question, then Christine?
Thank you for the explanation so far already. I have a question about, if I understand correctly, the representations are all in your head, like what you just explained. But in the lectures before, we also were told, like, we also have to take a look at the environment and the interaction with that. How does that feed into this? Like, do you also take that into account? Because I can have, for example, attitudes and lazy and stuff, so I always take the elevator, but now the elevator is broken, so because of the environment, I change my behavior. How do you translate the environment into step 3, or you just leave it out?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Normally what we do in step 3 is that you think about what's relevant in the environment, the environmental conditions, and then which environmental agents control those and what you need to change there. The dynamic, as it can unfold over time, when the environment changes and then people engage in different behaviors, that basically means that there is a different context for the behavior, which I think in step 2 I would tend to translate as having different sets of determinants, because actually your target behavior is a bit different. Because if you define the target behavior sufficiently specifically, it's going to the second floor using the stairs, or going to the second floor using the stairs if the elevator is broken, or something like that. But this makes it much more complicated, and in my experience, that's not usually what I have done so far. Maybe Rob, or Nel, or Maria, or Rick, or Jeroen, or Francine, or anybody else can chime in, if you have experience with this specific situation.
Yeah, but I think I'm not sure whether I get your question completely. I think the general answer would be everything that teaches them also applies to these environmental agents. So I think that is the general notion, and I think your thing is right. Once you implement your intervention and then suddenly something changes, I think that's not something we often do.
Yeah.
I mean, not at this level.
Yeah, so to summarize again a bit, basically, so far in intervention mapping, it hasn't, I think, been extended yet to cater to dynamic environments and then map the different potential situations in the environment and then provide for those. Yeah, it means you do the same thing but multiple times, I guess. And if you know that you can break the elevator, then normally you would just find out who is the environmental agent you need and bribe them to break the elevator. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. Maria?
Yeah, just to, I think just to have people think a little bit and add perhaps a little bit of complexity, but not to be applied during the course today or this week. So there is work that's being done in terms of how environments, and particularly early environments and things like trauma, influence those maps, like what he was talking about in terms of what is activated, right? And there is evidence that people who have lived in certain environments actually perceive things differently and interpret things differently. And I think that that's something that we have to continue to explore and think about as we move forward, particularly when we're thinking about behavior change among individuals who have experienced health inequities over long periods of time and social determinants of health. So it's something that we're just sort of starting to learn about, and then eventually we'll be able to think about it in terms of, well, how do we fit that into the planning process?
Yeah, perfect, thank you. Yes?
I have a question. Do these brain maps will inform like the pieces of theory, the areas of theory that I will choose for the intervention?
So the question is whether all this kind of informs the kind of theory that you use for the intervention. And yes, during a literature review, for example, you already encounter lots of theories that people have used to explain the same behavior. And generally in your planning group, you will have experts around behavior change in general, but also around the substantive area that you're working with. And they will also be familiar. So for example, if a behavior is highly habitual, then experts around sedentary behavior, for example, will know the most used theories to explain this kind of stuff. And those theories will tend to vary a bit. For example, the reasoned action approach is called the reasoned action approach, or the theory of planned behavior, which was its predecessor, because it deals with planned behavior or reasoned behavior. So that means that as soon as a behavior is mostly impulsive or habitual, the theory was just not designed to deal with that, so you just need different theories. So yeah, they can differ quite a bit from situation to situation.
And would be a case in which I will, based on the map of my target population, I would probably need to use like different areas of different theories. I don't know if
Yes. Yeah, so the question is whether sometimes, depending on, well, the map of people's psyche, so which things are relevant for target behavior, you would just kind of pick and mix elements from theories and decide this theory has these constructs that seem relevant and those that don't seem relevant, and this theory had these constructs that they say predict behavior that seem relevant and those that don't. And that's fine here. We use the theories because they kind of codify a lot of evidence we have about, in this case, if they are theory of behavior explanation, about why people do what they do. So they are kind of one way to explain a big set of evidence. But that doesn't mean, for example, take the theory of planned behavior again, that says you have attitude, norms, and self-efficacy. So if you have a behavior and you see it's mostly predicted by perceived norms and habit, you're free to take those two constructs from the theories. So it's quite eclectic, or as I prefer, promiscuous. Okay, if there are any other questions, you can ask them as we move along. So now we get to actually the interesting bit, how we change those subdeterminants. And for that we get back to these brain cells, to the neurons. So as I explained here, you have a lot of them, and they are connected to a lot of other neurons. But you all now have fewer connections than 5 years ago. I have considerably fewer than I did when I studied here. And that's because you learn. The way your brain learns is basically to retain connections that are somehow useful, beneficial. I don't know how it knows that. I guess it keeps track in a spreadsheet or something. And others just die off, kind of. So learning is basically the key. Learning is how you can change how people's brains work, and therefore you can change which signals are sent to people's motor neurons at which moments. And learning is not something that we were born with. Well, we were born with it, but the first organisms were not born with it, because it evolved over time. And the first learning process that evolved was habituation. So the first thing that any organism could do was ignore stuff that didn't matter. That's what habituation is. Basically, you learn in your environment that if you can't eat something, and it can't eat you, or at least doesn't try, and you can't procreate with it, it's safe to ignore. And you can already imagine how this represents a huge energy benefit for organisms, as opposed to trying to procreate with everything they see, or trying to run away from everything they see, or trying to eat everything they see, or all at the same time, which is very hard to do. So habituation explains why people can live close to a station or close to an airport, for example. Sensitization is kind of like the opposite. Like if you burned yourself, then immediately afterwards, everything will feel a bit hotter where you burned yourself. So instead of ignoring stuff, it makes you pay extra attention to things. Classical conditioning is the classical example of Pavlov, who noticed that when he entered his laboratory, his dog started drooling, which is not normally a reaction of dogs to people entering laboratories. And then he learned that actually, because feeding his dog was the first thing he did when he entered the laboratory, the dog linked this to the sound of his footsteps. And then he started doing experiments with this, and basically classical conditioning is the ability of organisms to link things that are not necessarily linked to each other. So for example, if you hear something making a sound like roaring or growling or whatever, you know you should maybe run, and you should maybe not try to eat it or procreate with it, depending on your preferences. I don't want to kink shame. Operant conditioning is kind of the same, but specifically applied to behavior. It's not just linking stimuli to each other, but linking rewards or punishments to your own behavior, which of course then leads to increases or decreases in the frequency of the behavior. Affective learning generalizes over conditioning. It's basically why if you are in a new city, say Maastricht, and you see a dark alleyway, you're like, oh, that feels a bit unsafe, maybe I shouldn't go in there, even though you've never been there. So you can't have conditioned that specific stimulus because it's a new stimulus. And affective learning generalizes over those specific links. Procedural memory allows you to connect motor programs, small motor programs, into more complex things, like tying your shoelaces is an example. That's apparently super hard to do if you consciously try to say, now I do this, now I do this. But if you automatically do it, it's, well, for some people still very hard, but for a lot of people quite easy. Cognitive maps is your ability to create a map of your environment, allowing you to take routes that you've never taken before, because you have a representation of how it looks. Vicarious learning is one that's used a lot for prevention efforts. And because it's so important, I created a small movie to illustrate it. And this was when it was still a lot of work to create a movie in PowerPoint, which is why it's short, so you really have to pay attention. Ready? He's dead. Which is sad for Barney, but good for us, because now it allows us to, or me, to explain vicarious learning. Vicarious learning is why Fred Flintstone, well, maybe not Fred Flintstone, because he wasn't exactly the brightest tool in the shed, but generally another organism would now know to not enter the bush. The idea here is that so far, all the learning processes require the organism to experience something for themselves. And then they could learn about their environment and how they relate to it. This was the first learning process that evolved that allowed indirect, well, vicarious learning through observing other organisms. And that's, of course, it didn't, organisms don't mimic every behavior they see. So all these learning processes only work under very specific circumstances. In this case, for example, the organisms generally are only learning from other organisms they identify with, that are similar to them. So if a saber-toothed tiger is very hungry and it's at the top of a cliff and there's a bird sitting next to it because it is a vegetarian, so it didn't eat the bird, and the bird is also hungry and the bird flies down the cliff to eat a nice little berry from a berry bush, then the saber-toothed tiger, of course, doesn't try to fly down the cliff to eat a berry, because saber-toothed tigers who did copy all the behaviors they saw were selected out by evolution. So generally, these learning processes are super powerful, but they also come with a very specific set of parameters. They generally don't work because they just evolved to make sure that organisms procreate more eventually. And not for us to change in interventions. So if you want to change and use any of these, you really have to respect the parameters of use. Abstract concept learning is something that evolved much later, that allows representation of symbols for things that aren't there, things that are in the environment. And reflective learning, as far as we know, is the one that evolved last, and that only we can do. And it uses your so-called episodic memory, which is your memory about what happened to you. And this is basically that you can sit and ponder last Saturday night and we're like, oh, was that so smart? Or something like that. So these evolved over time, and therefore fewer and fewer living beings have them as you go down the list. If you use behavior change methods, you always use these. But you don't use them directly because they're super rudimentary. So in practice, we use behavior change methods, and these behavior change methods use one or more of these evolved learning processes. So for example, planning coping responses is one. It uses procedural memory and reflective learning. And these behavior change methods have a kind of description, what you do when you apply them. And they have these parameters of use, the conditions you have to satisfy for them to work. And those basically describe how, as far as we know, you make sure you resemble the conditions for the underlying evolved learning processes enough, so that they actually work. These are in the book. They're also in this open access article. And there are in the version of the book from 2016. I'm not sure about the next version yet. Maybe Maria knows by heart, but I guess with these large numbers you often don't. In the last version, there were 99 of these methods. So then the question becomes, which methods do you need to change the behavior you want to change? The problem here is that if you talk to people about why they do what they do, they usually don't say, this is the method you need to use. They usually say things like this. If you take the example again from my research about highly dosed MDMA, so the strong ecstasy pills, so they think about whether they like the effects of strong ecstasy pills, they think about what their friends think they should do, whether they can even obtain pills with a low dose, whether a high dose facilitates connecting to others, whether a high dose gives them more energy, what they think their friends do, which is of course not always what their friends do, because nobody knows what their friends do, really. You just have a representation of what they do. Whether they are even able to determine the dose accurately, because if you don't get your pills tested, which you can do in the Netherlands, so if you intend to use MDMA while you stay here, make sure you get it tested. If you don't get it tested, obviously you can't dose properly. Whether you will still remember everything if you use a high dose, which you won't, but some people might not be aware of that. Whether a higher dose is more unhealthy, which it is, but some people think that a higher dose is more healthy, because they think that if you have a higher dose of the active substance in the drug, there's less room for adulterants in the pill, which is insane, but people think the most interesting things. Whether a high dose makes you hallucinate more or less, and whether they like to hallucinate more, because some people might like to hallucinate and some people might not. Of course, if you want to hallucinate, there are other drugs that are better suited. But still, people might have easy access to MDMA and not to LSD or 2CB or other more hallucinogenic drugs. So this is what you get if you talk to people. That's why psychologists try to not talk to people so much, because it's always a mess. But that's what you get if you talk to people and you ask them why they do what they do. So the question is, how do you link this to the methods of behavior change? And the answer is, again, in the little balls, basically, you cluster stuff. This is why we have theory. And that's why those determinants are generic. They say, this is what attitudinal beliefs look like. Because they are always expectations about the consequences of engaging in the behavior and your evaluation of those consequences. And that allows you to talk to people and ask why they do what they do, what their considerations are, and then cluster those into those different determinants. And those determinants, we get them from theories, of course. They have the definitions. They tell us when something is what, basically. And those determinants also determine which methods you use. Because attitude, because it is always about people's expectations about the consequences of behavior and their evaluation of the consequences, that means that it relates to specific parts of their psyche, specific parts of their memory, so to speak, which means that specific evolved learning processes work to change those bits of their psyche. And that means that specific methods work to change attitude, because the methods use those more rudimentary evolved learning processes. So the learning processes are how organisms can learn. That's inevitably what you need. In that sense, Francois, this is a bit like education science. It's all learning. You always use evolved learning processes, but they are super rudimentary. So what we use in practice are the methods of behavior change, which are a bit higher level with a recipe of how to use them, but they still map onto learning processes that relate to parts of people's psyche because they evolved over time. So for example, reflective learning relates to your episodic memory. Other parts relates to procedural memory, etc. So that's why we use both the determinants at the generic level, even though that's never what we target in intervention. In intervention, you always have to target stuff at the specific level, the subdeterminants or change objectives, because those are about the specific expectations that people have that cause them to engage in the behavior. But you need to know that those expectations are attitude to know which methods you can use to change them. And then you have perceived norm, you have self-efficacy. There are loads of these. There are dozens, hundreds of determinants. In psychology, there's a kind of saying that for a well-respected psychologist, a theory is kind of like a toothbrush. Nobody would ever use somebody else's. And unfortunately, that's somewhat true. So we have slightly too many theories. But in the context of, and that's scientifically a problem, but in the context of intervention mapping, that's not so much a problem. Because as we addressed earlier, they're just tools for you. You don't really care about which theory is really right or not. You're super pragmatic. You just care about which theories can help you understand why people do what they do. But the constructs also have to have some methods available, of course. So if there's a fancy new theory that would somehow have very different parts of people's psyche that have never been studied before, I mean, that would be quite groundbreaking, but you never know, then it's quite unlikely that we also know how to change those things. And if there are no methods, then that's frustrating, because then you can't change stuff. So you can use whichever theory, but it does help if there are some methods available for the constructs, the determinants you want to target. And then you start targeting the specific little bits in the clouds, the subdeterminants, the specific ideas people have. Okay, so an intervention can only work if it contains methods for behavior change that work, that are effective, and they target the determinants, or better yet, the subdeterminants that are relevant for the target behavior and for the target population. And then if that all works, then at the right moment, the right signal will go to people's muscles and they will perform the right behavior, and then their health and quality of life will improve. So these methods for behavior change are generic, just like the determinants, and that's why they're matched at that level. But you target subdeterminants. That's what forms the messages in your intervention. So you have to translate these methods also to a practical application. Vicarious learning, for example, modeling, so using a role model to do something, can look loads of different ways. You can do it in a comic, you can do it on a billboard, you can do it in a video, in a serious game, whatever. What you choose, which practical application of the method you choose, depends on lots of things. For example, the parameters, those conditions for effectiveness that we mentioned earlier, population characteristics, culture, context. So you could use very different looking things, very different applications, but they can all implement the same method. Christine, this is one of the reasons why we don't use the behavior change techniques that the London group uses, because they don't distinguish these two. They just have the techniques which kind of mix them together. They also don't have the parameters. So modeling, for example, you can translate them based on all these characteristics into using like role-playing, or you can make a little video, or you can make billboards, but they would all work because they implement modeling. They implement vicarious learning, which allows them to change certain parts of people's psyche. So those are the missing links. Subdeterminants are targeted by applications. They work because they implement behavior change principles or behavior change techniques. And those only work if you respect the parameters for effectiveness, because those make sure that they sufficiently resemble the underlying evolved learning processes, which is why they actually work. Because those evolved learning processes are, as far as we know, the only ways organisms can learn anything. So any change in anybody's psyche has to work through those, inevitably. So for example, you want people to dose ecstasy within the recommendation, and who wouldn't want that? For that, one of the sub-behaviors would be that they have to decide to avoid a high dose of ecstasy. We know that that is predicted by the attitude, and the specific sub-determinant is that they have to realize that if they use a high dose, time seems to pass faster, so they actually get a worse experience in the end. We know that persuasive communication can work to target this, and we decide to use an infographic to convey this, and one of the parameters is that the message has to be perceived as relevant by the target audience. This is one causal structural chain with 7 links. And of course, an intervention consists of multiple of those chains. And if one of the subdeterminants actually doesn't matter for the target behavior, then you lose the entire chain. There's no change there. If you use a behavior change method that doesn't actually work, you also lose that chain. If you target a sub-behavior that doesn't really matter, you also lose that chain. And then, of course, people are also different. So for some people, you might actually be able to change a belief, but for them it might just not be relevant. So this is kind of how you often design an intervention. You design it for a big group, and you try to capture all the subdeterminants and then link them to methods that can work to change them, so that you prepare for the highest possible impact. And then, of course, you make sure that all the stuff with the crosses that you can control, that you target the right subdeterminants, you use methods that work, you use target behaviors that work, that you optimize, and you accept that still for some people it just won't really work because for them norms are just not so relevant. Okay, so to help with this, we created the ABCD, the acyclic behavior change diagram, which is what you'll be working with mostly today. And it's created from a spreadsheet that actually just has those causal structural chains. So it has 7 columns from behavior change principle all the way to target behavior. And as you see, the same information is repeated. So the target behavior is actually the same. The rightmost column is the same for every chain, because every chain stands on its own. Every chain expresses your assumptions about why a part of your intervention will work on its own. And you basically just type all this in, and then you have an entire blueprint of why you think the things you do will change what in people's minds. And then you can convert this into the diagram itself, which looks like this, and is much more convenient for discussing with other intervention developers, with your planning group, with ultimately the companies who will create the intervention. Yes?
So the parameters, do we have to make sure that are effective, so do we do research on them, or just go look at the literature, or?
Yeah, good question. So basically, where do you get the parameters? And the answer is, again, it's a bit repetitive, but basically you have to make sure you have expertise on, in this case, behavior change in the target group. Ideally, in the best case, if you already know which kinds of methods you want to use, people who study those, because they will be automatically, without having to do more research, up to date regarding the literature, so they will know most about the parameters. The intervention mapping book lists parameters. They have the tables and they have the methods with the explanation of how to use them and the parameters. But they also very explicitly say, or very explicitly, they say, so Nel and Rob and Maria and Rick, they say that those are a starting point. So, because of course we ideally, in science, learn stuff. So ideally they're a starting point, and then you look for more information about parameters and how to use them better, the method. Okay, so these ABCDs show the target behavior and the sub-behaviors that you distinguish, which is great, because then if you communicate with other experts, they can say, oh, you missed the target behavior, or oh, I hadn't thought of that one. Then they explain which determinants, according to your research or your assumptions, predict those sub-behaviors. Then they show which specific sub-determinants are relevant. That's, of course, where the magic happens, so to speak. That's actually what you will target with the intervention within each determinant. And then it will show which applications you use to target those sub-behaviors, why you think those applications will work. In other words, which behavior change methods you implement in them. And here you have one behavior change method for every application, but in practice you often combine multiple methods in one application and have the same method for multiple applications. And they show the parameters of use that you distinguished, which can be those from the book, if there were no updates, or if you are very tight on resources, because that might also happen, then you just have to use what's in the book because you can't talk to people and you can't do research. But of course this does very clearly document for future you and for others why you think what you do will work. And it also allows you to iterate on it. Because often there is room for improvement left if you do something, even if you try to do it as well as you can. So if you have resources, you generally want to iterate and make things better in life. Okay, so you basically fill out a spreadsheet, and then from the spreadsheet you can create the diagram. And for that we created an app, which is in the material, so you can just look for it there. If you want to remember it, it's basically ABC, Academy of Behavior Change.eu, which is where we are, /apps/ABCD, which is the name of this specific app. And if you open it, it starts with a welcome page, which links to some resources, including an example. And then you can click the Data tab. The Data tab is in the top left. And then it's easiest usually to create a Google Sheet, because then you can just collaborate easily with others. And then you can copy-paste the link there. You can also use a spreadsheet, and then you can upload it on the left there. If you use a Google Sheet, you can just copy-paste the link from the address bar. But you have to make sure, using the share button, that it's actually accessible to others, that it can be viewed publicly. Well, then you paste it there, then it will load it. You see it here at the bottom. If you click Generate Plot, it will, unsurprisingly, generate the plot. And then you can download it. And if you download it, you might want to download it as SVG, because that's a format that's lossless, as it's called. You can zoom in as much as you want without losing any quality, but you can also change it quite easily afterwards. In, for example, the excellent free program Inkscape, like landscape, but Inkscape. So that allows you to change anything about the SVG that you want. There's also some documentation here, which is in the slides, but you have more than enough documentation in the course, so that's not really necessary. So you start with determinants. You learn as much as possible. If you can do a quantitative study, you can create a cyberplot. You use this to select your determinants based on how relevant they are and how changeable they are. Then you put those in your matrices of change objectives, which show the full overview of everything you want to change. You enter the selected change objectives into your ABCD matrix, and you supplement it with the information about how you want to change stuff. Then you have the matrix, and then you can discuss that with external organizations like the advertising agency or the builder or whatever who will create it. In this process, you also have to think about whether you want to combine applications. So if you do something in schools, for example, you have to choose whether you have one session, one lesson, or 3 lessons, for example. And there are benefits and drawbacks to everything, of course. If you have multiple components, you have to decide which order they have. Sometimes it's important to target certain determinants before you target others. For example, if you ever want to do anything with perceived risk, then generally you want to make sure that people have a very high self-efficacy before you expose them to potentially threatening information. If there's any interactivity, you have to scope the review, scope the process to make sure you decide what's within scope, what can be discussed and what can't. And generally you want a kind of theme that communicates the intervention clearly to people, both to intermediaries, if for example nurses or teachers have to do something, but also to your target audience. And these are called the components, the sequence, the scope, and the themes of the intervention. So that's basically what you do in step 3. You generate those, and then you combine it all with the methods that you want to target. It's important to keep checking your change objectives, because in this process you can kind of lose track of some of those. So make sure you double check those. And finally, before we go to the questions, if you work with executive organizations, supervise them very closely. Because especially advertising agencies, their unique selling point kind of tends to be that they know behavior change. That doesn't tend to be their expertise necessarily. So that can be not straightforward, that process. And if basically not everybody respects each other's expertise, that can be kind of hard. So it's quite important, and that's why the ABCD is useful, to make sure that everything you put in there actually ends up in the intervention ultimately. Yes, sorry.
No, I'm wondering if we can do like a pilot study before we like implement or test this intervention. Thinking, maybe if I need to change parameters. Or change
Yeah, excellent question. Whether you can do pilot studies before you implement an intervention. Actually, yeah, not only can you, but you should ideally. That's in step 4, where you ideally test maybe the entire intervention, maybe parts of the intervention, just to see whether the change objectives you want to target actually change and whether you can improve stuff. And that's both about which bits work and which have room for improvement, and also about what like advertising agencies call the tone of voice. Like for example, whether your target audience likes it, whether they would even go there and stuff like that. So excellent question. You definitely want to do that if you have the resources again. Because okay, so to implement it in the entire intervention mapping process, you started with the needs assessment on Monday. Then you know what actually needs to happen. Then yesterday you did the determinant analysis, and then you select the determinant so you know what needs to change in your target audience's psyche. Then in step 3, you select the methods and the applications. Then in step 4, you'll work on the intervention, including pre-testing and pilot testing. And then in step 5 and 6 are a bit special, because as you probably heard on Monday, you are working on them from the beginning. You anticipate who needs to do what to implement the intervention and make sure it's structurally implemented. So do school directors need to budget for structurally doing something, and do lesson plans need to change every year, stuff like that. And the evaluation. How will you actually find out which parts can be improved? Because you also want to know whether it works, and perhaps do a cost effectiveness analysis. But generally, especially if you work in an NGO, for example, with the same substantive area, and you're not in a project of 3 or 4 years, but you will be working on the same thing, you want to anticipate on iterative improvement. And for that, this is really important. And then usually you continue the cycle. So that was this presentation. The slides are here that can be sent around as well. And thank you for your attention.